In the autumn of 1945, a bowl of white rice was worth more than money in Tokyo. The rice paddies had been bombed, the shipping lanes were gone, and the harvest that should have fed 70 million people fell to less than a third of what the country needed. Mothers boiled a single cup of rice into a pot big enough to feed 6, stretching every grain until the water turned cloudy and thick enough to call a meal. This was not poverty in the way we think of poverty today. This was a nation eating grass, bark, and the sweepings from a rice mill floor to survive a winter that killed more people from starvation than the firebombing had killed the year before. And here is what nobody tells you. Some of what those families invented in that hunger, out of nothing, out of desperation, tasted better than what came after it. Number 14 on this list fed an entire neighborhood block out of a single iron pot that never went cold. Number 7 was a dish so despised during the war that people were ashamed to eat it in front of neighbors. And today, a bowl of it costs $12 in Tokyo. And number 1 was the meal a mother in Hiroshima made from a single sweet potato, split 6 ways, that her daughter still cannot eat without crying. By the winter of 1945, over 10 million Japanese were classified as facing starvation. The rice ration, when it came at all, arrived weeks late and cut to a fraction of what a working adult needed to survive a day of labor. Farmers hid grain from government requisition officers. City dwellers rode trains for hours into the countryside to trade kimono silk and family heirlooms for a sack of potatoes. Before we get into the list, hit subscribe, because what these families figured out in the hungriest years in Japan's modern history is knowledge that almost nobody alive still remembers how to use. Let's count down 18 forgotten meals that kept Japan alive when there was almost nothing left to eat. Number 18. Daikon Gohan. Rice was the single most precious thing in a Japanese kitchen in 1946. And no family with children could justify a pot of pure white rice when there was none to spare. So mothers took the humble daikon radish, shredded it fine, salted it to draw out the water, and folded it directly into whatever rice they had left, sometimes at a ratio of 2 parts daikon to 1 part rice. The starch of the radish softened as it cooked and took on the texture of the grain around it, tricking a hungry stomach into believing it had eaten twice what was actually in the pot. Farming families in Nagano and Niigata swear the dish tasted better with the daikon leaves chopped and stirred in at the last minute, bitter and green against the sweetness of the root. City families without a vegetable garden bought daikon by the cartload from farmers willing to trade for almost anything, because unlike rice, the radish could still be grown in a bombed field. A grandmother in Sendai once said that Daikon Gohan was the taste of being told, quietly and without words, that there would be enough to eat tonight. Number 17. Imo Gohan. When even daikon ran short, the sweet potato took its place, and for many rural families it did more than take its place. It became the entire meal. A single sweet potato, diced small, steamed directly into the rice cooker or the iron pot over the fire, could turn 1 cup of grain into a dish that filled 4 stomachs instead of 1. The sweetness of the potato against the plain rice was, for a generation of children who grew up in the late 1940s, the flavor of childhood itself, not because it was a treat, but because it was what there was. Farmers in Kyushu, where sweet potatoes had been planted in every available patch of soil during the war years on direct government order, ate imo gohan for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for entire seasons at a time. Decades later, elderly Japanese who lived through the famine years describe a strange grief at the sight of a supermarket sweet potato, an ingredient the modern world treats as a snack, and their generation still quietly treats as the food that kept them breathing. Number 16. Suiton. If there is one dish that defines the hunger of wartime and post-war Japan more than any other, it is suiton, a thin soup of wheat flour dumplings boiled in whatever broth a family could scrape together, often nothing more than salted water with a scrap of dried fish or a few wilted greens. Flour, unlike rice, could sometimes be obtained from American food aid shipments that began arriving through relief organizations in 1946, and families mixed it with water into a rough, unleavened dough, tearing off small pieces with wet fingers and dropping them straight into the boiling pot. The dumplings were dense, chewy, and utterly without flavor on their own, which is exactly why the broth mattered so much. Every bone, every fish head, every wilted cabbage leaf saved specifically to give the Suiton pot something to taste like. The dish became so associated with deprivation that for an entire generation, the smell of boiling flour dumplings alone was enough to bring back the hunger of 1946. Number 15. Okara no Nemono. Soybeans were pressed for their milk to make tofu, and what was left behind, the fibrous pulp called okara, was traditionally considered animal feed, barely fit for human consumption. But in a country with almost no meat, almost no fat, and almost no protein of any kind reaching civilian tables, okara became a delicacy out of necessity. Simmered slowly with whatever vegetables could be found, carrot peels, the tough outer leaves of cabbage, a single dried mushroom stretched across an entire pot. The pulp took on flavor and became genuinely filling, thick with fiber and just enough protein to matter. Tofu shops that had once thrown okara away by the cartload found themselves selling it for money, sometimes more money per pound than the tofu itself, because it fed more mouths for longer. A dish born from what wealthier households would have discarded became, for a few desperate years, one of the only reliable sources of protein a working-class Japanese family could obtain. Number 14. Zosui. In the coldest months of the famine years, when firewood itself was rationed and every calorie of heat had to serve double duty, families made zosui, a thin rice porridge stretched with whatever vegetables, fish scraps, or single egg could be spared, cooked down until the rice broke apart and thickened the broth around it. A single bowl of zosui, made from the leftover rice at the bottom of the pot that would otherwise have gone to waste, could be reheated and thinned with water 3 or 4 times across a week, each version a little more watery than the last, until there was nothing left to add water to. Neighborhood blocks in bombed-out Tokyo districts sometimes cooked zosui communally over a single fire, an iron pot that never fully emptied, refilled by whoever had managed to find an extra vegetable or a handful of dried fish that day. It was, by every modern culinary standard, an almost flavorless dish. It was also, by the account of survivors, one of the only things standing between a family and starvation during the worst winter Japan had faced in a century. Number 13. Kokutu to Gohan. Sugar had all but vanished from civilian life during the war, rationed at levels so low that most households had not tasted anything sweet in years by 1946. What returned first, in small and precious quantities from Okinawa and southern trade routes, was kokutu, unrefined black sugar, dark, mineral, and nothing like the white sugar of pre-war Japan. A pinch of it stirred into a bowl of plain rice was, for children who had never known anything but bitterness and salt, a taste closer to a religious experience than a snack. Mothers hoarded kokutu the way other households hoarded gold, doling it out a few grains at a time, saving it for a child's birthday or a sick family member who needed something, anything, to make eating feel less like a chore and more like being cared for. Elderly Japanese who lived through this period still describe the specific mineral sweetness of kokutu with more emotion than they describe almost any other food from their childhood, because it was the first sign that the hardest years might eventually end. Number 12. Gyoza made with cabbage core. Meat was a fantasy in most Japanese households through the late 1940s, but the craving for something wrapped and savory did not disappear simply because the ingredients did. Resourceful mothers, many of them influenced by Manchurian and Chinese cooking brought back by returning soldiers and repatriated families, learned to make gyoza filling almost entirely from vegetables, using the tough, usually discarded core of a cabbage minced fine, mixed with whatever scallion greens survived in a window box and bound together with a single precious egg if one could be found. Wrapped in a thin flour dough stretched as far as it could possibly go, the dumplings were pan-fried in the smallest amount of oil a family could justify, just enough to crisp the bottoms and make the whole kitchen smell for a few minutes like something other than hunger. These vegetable gyoza became so beloved that when meat finally returned to Japanese tables in the 1950s, many families kept making them the old way, cabbage and all. Number 11. Kujira no Tatsutaje. When conventional livestock had been decimated by the war and beef and pork remained impossibly scarce well into the 1950s, whale meat became, almost overnight, the primary source of animal protein for ordinary Japanese families, cheap, abundant, and actively promoted by a government desperate to feed a starving population. Whale meat coated in soy sauce, ginger, and a thin dusting of potato starch, then fried until the outside turned deep brown and crisp, became a staple of school lunch programs, the first taste of real meat an entire generation of Japanese children ever had. It was simply what protein looked like, the dish that meant a family had managed, against everything working against them, to put something substantial on the table. Number 10. Nukazuki. With refrigeration essentially non-existent and every vegetable a family could grow needing to last through months without fresh produce, the ancient technique of rice bran pickling became not a delicacy but a survival tool. A wooden barrel of fermenting rice bran, salt, and water sat in nearly every kitchen, tended daily, used to preserve cucumbers, eggplant, daikon, and cabbage for months at a time. A family's nukadoko, the fermented bran bed itself, was treated almost like a living member of the household, passed down for generations because a well-maintained bed could keep a family in vegetables through an entire winter. The pickles that emerged, sour, salty, and packed with the kind of gut bacteria modern nutritionists now study, were often the only vegetable a family ate for days at a stretch, and the daily ritual of turning the bran bed became, for many mothers, one of the few small acts of control they had over feeding their families. Number 9. Katsuobushi Ochazuke. When there was nothing else, and the rice itself had gone cold and hard, families poured hot green tea directly over a bowl of leftover rice, topped with the thinnest possible shavings of dried, smoked bonito. Katsuobushi, shaved so sparingly that a single block could season a family's meals for a week. The hot tea softened the rice back into something edible, and the umami of the fish shavings, even in trace amounts, was enough to convince an exhausted body that it had eaten something with substance. Katsuobushi itself was rationed and precious, and a family that still had a block of it in the pantry by 1947 was considered fortunate. It was what a mother made at the end of a day when there was truly nothing left to cook, and it became one of the most quietly comforting dishes in Japanese food memory. Number 8. Mochi. Rice mochi, pounded and stretched into a sticky, chewy treat traditionally reserved for New Year celebrations, required more rice than almost any family could spare during the famine years. So resourceful cooks substituted mashed sweet potato for the rice flour, kneading it with a small amount of whatever starch was available, sometimes potato starch, sometimes the last of a bag of rice flour, and pan-frying small cakes of it until the outside caramelized and the inside turned soft and slightly sweet. Mochi allowed families to keep a piece of ritual and celebration alive even in years when there was almost nothing to celebrate. A small cake shaped like tradition made from an ingredient of necessity. Children who grew up eating mochi at New Year instead of true rice mochi often say they did not realize until years later that what they were eating was a substitute at all. To them, it was simply what New Year tasted like. Number 7. Kasutera imitation made without sugar or eggs. Kasutera, the soft Portuguese-derived sponge cake that had become a beloved delicacy in pre-war Japan, required sugar, eggs, and wheat flour in quantities that made it almost mythical during the famine years. And yet mothers tried anyway, using a thin batter of what flour they had, a mashed sweet potato for sweetness and moisture in place of sugar, and whatever leavening they could improvise, baked in a covered pan over low coals because no household oven existed. The result bore only a passing resemblance to true Kasutera, dense, barely sweet, sometimes slightly bitter from the improvised leavening. Families were embarrassed to serve it to guests and ashamed of how far it fell short of the pre-war version everyone remembered. Today, a proper slice of Kasutera in a Tokyo department store costs the equivalent of $12 for a small wedge wrapped in gold paper as a luxury gift. The post-war imitation that families were once ashamed of has become, in the memory of the generation that ate it, a strange and complicated symbol of survival itself. Number 6. Compito rationed one piece at a time. Not a meal, but impossible to leave off this list. Compito, the tiny star-shaped sugar candies that had been a beloved treat since the Portuguese first brought them to Japan centuries earlier, became so scarce during the famine years that a single piece was sometimes rationed to a child as an entire birthday present. Mothers kept a small paper packet of compito hidden away, doling out one piece at a time for good behavior, for a fever survived, for a birthday that could not otherwise be celebrated with anything else. Children who lived through this era describe the specific memory of a single grain of colored sugar dissolving slowly on the tongue with more clarity and more emotion than almost any other food memory from their childhood, because in a world with almost nothing sweet, one piece of candy carried the emotional weight of an entire celebration. Number 5. Dojo nabe. Loach, a small freshwater fish similar to an eel, thrived in the flooded rice paddies and irrigation channels across rural Japan, and unlike livestock, it required no feed, no land, and no government requisition to obtain. Families who lived near rice paddies caught dojo by hand or with simple traps, simmering them whole in a shallow iron pot with burdock root, scallion, and a splash of precious soy sauce, the fish cooking down until the bones softened enough to eat entirely. Dojo nabe became, for landlocked rural families far from any coast, one of the only reliable sources of animal protein available without money or ration coupons. Urban families considered it a luxury precisely because it represented something increasingly rare, protein that came directly from the land for free. Number 4. Kabocha no nemono, made with the seeds and skin. Pumpkin, one of the few vegetables that grew reliably in the poor, bomb-damaged soil around Japanese cities, was treated by desperate families as an entire pantry rather than a single vegetable. The flesh was simmered in a thin broth of soy sauce and whatever sugar could be spared. The skin, tough and usually discarded, was scraped, sliced thin, and cooked alongside the flesh. The seeds were roasted over the coals of the cooking fire and eaten as a rare, salty snack, one of the only sources of fat many families had access to for months at a time. Nothing about a pumpkin was wasted because nothing could afford to be wasted. Number 3. Hoshimo. Sweet potatoes sliced thin and dried in the sun on straw mats became one of the most important preserved foods of the famine years, a way of extending a single harvest across months when fresh food simply did not exist. Chewy, deeply sweet, and dense with calories in a way fresh sweet potato was not, Hoshimo could be carried by workers into the fields, given to children as one of the only naturally sweet foods available, and stored without refrigeration for the entire winter. Entire rural communities dedicated hillsides to drying racks each autumn, and a family's supply of Hoshimo, carefully rationed piece by piece, often determined whether the coldest months of the year were survivable or genuinely desperate. Today, Hoshimo is sold in convenience stores across Japan as a wholesome snack, its origins as a famine-era survival food almost entirely forgotten by the generation that now eats it casually between meals. Number 2. Wheat bran bread made from what the animals used to eat. As white flour vanished entirely from civilian markets, some of the only grain still available to ordinary families was fusuma, coarse wheat bran that had, before the war, been sold exclusively as livestock feed. Mixed with a small amount of whatever finer flour could be found and a pinch of precious yeast, fusuma bread baked into something dense, gritty, and difficult to swallow, a texture survivors describe even decades later with a kind of grim honesty. And yet it was bread, actual bread, in a country where bread itself had briefly become nearly impossible to obtain. Families who ate fusuma bread through the worst months of 1946 remember it not fondly, but with a specific, hard-earned respect, because it was the difference between an empty table and a full one, however coarse that fullness tasted. Number 1. A single sweet potato split 6 ways by a mother in Hiroshima. This was not a recipe. It requires no measurements, no method, no historical footnote beyond what it was. In the ruins of a city that had lost nearly everything, a mother with 6 children and 1 sweet potato cut it, as evenly as her hands could manage, into 6 pieces, and gave one to each child before eating nothing herself. There was no ceremony to it, no dish to name, nothing to write down for a future generation except the fact that it happened. In that kitchen and in 10,000 kitchens like it across a broken country, night after night, for years. Her daughter, interviewed decades later as an elderly woman, said she still cannot look at a sweet potato in a market without seeing her mother's hands dividing it, and without understanding, more completely than any history book ever taught her, what her mother gave up so that 6 children could eat that night. These 18 dishes were not the food of a nation that had given up. They were the food of a nation that refused to. Every grain of rice stretched with a radish, every scrap of brawn turned into bread, every single piece of candy rationed out one at a time, was an act of quiet, relentless determination by mothers, grandmothers, and families who had almost nothing left except the will to keep the people they loved alive one more day. We inherited a country built on that determination and mostly forgot the meals that made it possible. Try one of them this week, the Daikon Gohan or the Zosui or the pumpkin-cooked skin, seeds, and all, and when it tastes better and more satisfying than you expected, remember that it was never really about the ingredients. It was about the people who refused to let a single one of them go to waste. Tell me in the comments which one of these your own grandmother or great-grandmother might have made, or whether there's a dish from your own family's hardest years that still hasn't made it onto a list like this one. That knowledge deserves to be remembered, not lost.